At the very start of the text, Engels gives a definition of modern or scientific socialism. He says that modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers. So right off the bat, Engels lists the two factors of scientific socialism. First, the understanding of the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and second, the anarchy of production. Throughout the rest of this text, Engels will give us a historical account of utopian socialism and why it was insufficient to bring about revolution. The next quote I read is still from very early on in the text in the second paragraph. He, when talking about the French revolutionaries, said that they recognized no external authority whatsoever of any kind. Religion, natural science, society, political institutions, everything was subjected to the most unsparing criticism. This sentence shows that those French revolutionaries were attempting to use a materialist outlook to critically analyze all things. But Engels goes on to say, we know now today that this kingdom of reason was nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie. He says, the great thinkers of the 18th century could, no more than their predecessors, go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch. So these French revolutionaries who wanted to be the most perfect materialists and be critical of everything were limited in their theory and practice by the material conditions of their epoch. Quickly, Engels goes into the three utopians mentioned most in the text, Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. And he quickly discusses one of the most overlooked things about utopian socialism. He says that one thing common to all three, not one of them appears as a representative of the interests of the proletariat, which historical development had, in the meantime, produced. Like the French philosophers, they do not claim to emancipate a particular class to begin with, but all humanity all at once. It is clearly utopian to think that the abolishment of private property would serve the interests of all people. It would only serve the interests of the vast majority of people, the exploited classes. It would be very contrary to the interests of the ruling class, the property classes, and that's something that these utopians failed or refused to grasp. So what made these utopians idealist? Engels points out in this passage, if pure reason and justice have not hitherto ruled the world, this has been the case only because men have not rightly understood them. What was wanted was the individual man of genius, who has now risen and who now understands the truth. That he has now arisen, that the truth has now been clearly understood, it is not an inevitable event, following of the necessity of the chain of historical development, but a mere happy accident. He might just as well have been born 500 years earlier, and then we might have spared humanity 500 years of error, strife, and suffering. Clearly, this idealist approach falls apart when analyzed scientifically. Just as it would have been impossible to invent the car before the wheel was invented, just as it would have been impossible to even conceive of an MRI machine before we understood the fundamental mechanics of the neurons in the brain, so too it would have been impossible for somebody to understand what socialism is and how to achieve it 500 years ago before the productive forces of capitalism had taken over. Next, Engels discusses a little bit of the evolution of capitalism. He writes, freedom of property from feudal fetters, now veritably accomplished, turned out to be, for the small capitalist and small proprietor, the freedom to sell their small property, crushed under the overmastering competition of the large capitalists and landlords, to these great lords, and thus, as far as the small capitalists and peasant proprietors were concerned, became freedom from property. So this shows very early on the evolution of this free market capitalism that reactionaries yearn to return to this small business owner, this it's only monopolies that are killing us. This is an inherent fundamental feature in capitalism, which is explained very concisely by Engels here, and it has existed since the very beginnings of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Immediately after this, Engels gives a very concise example of alienation. He writes that cash payments became more and more, in Carlyle's phase, the sole nexus between man and man. He discusses that basically the relationships between people have been reduced or commodified. It's very rare to have a relationship between somebody that you're not either paying or being paid by. You might think that Engels is being very critical of the utopians, but I don't think that could be further from the truth. He writes, at this time, however, the capitalist mode of production, and with it the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, was still very incompletely developed. This historical situation dominated the founders of socialism. To the crude conditions of capitalist production and the crude class conditions corresponded crude theories. Basically, like he stated in other words earlier, it would have been impossible to expect these utopians to come up with a scientific version of their theory, aka Marxism, because the conditions of capitalism had not yet progressed to that stage where it would have been possible to imagine these things. To finalize this chapter in the book, Engels describes the utopians' mode of thought more completely. To all of these utopians, socialism is the expression of the absolute truth, reason, and justice, and has only to be discovered to conquer the whole world by virtue of its own power. And as an absolute truth, it is independent of time, space, and of the historical development of man. It is a mere accident when and where it is discovered. With all of this, absolute truth, reason, and justice are different with the founder of each different school. And each one's special kind of absolute truth and reason and justice is again conditioned by his subjective understanding, his conditions of existence, the measure of his knowledge and his intellectual training. There is no other ending possible in this conflict of absolute truths than that they shall be mutually exclusive of the other. Hence, from this nothing could ever come out but a kind of eclectic average socialism, which, as a matter of fact, has up to present time dominated the minds of most of the socialist workers in France and England. Hence, a mismatch allowing of the most manifold shades of opinion, a mismatch of such critical statements, economic theories, pictures of future society by the founders of different sects, a mismatch which is the more easily brewed and the more definitive of the sharp edges of the individual constituents are rubbed down in the steam of debate, like rounded pebbles in a brook. To make a science of socialism, it first had to be placed upon a real basis. In the next chapter, Engels begins to outline the development of scientific socialism. He starts by discussing dialectics. The primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world is that of ancient Greek philosophy. Everything is and is not, for everything is fluid, constantly changing, constantly coming into being and passing away. This provides the philosophical basis for historical materialism. Everything is fluid, everything is constantly changing, constantly coming into being and giving away. This can be used and applied to the historical basis of the means of production. First, slave society came into being, and then it passed away, giving rise to feudal society, which came into being and then passed away, giving rise to capitalist society, which came into being and will hopefully soon pass away, giving rise to socialist society. He then provides maybe the most clear example of a metaphysical analysis in any of Marx or Engels' classical works. He writes, to the metaphysician, things and their mental reflexes are isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation, fixed, rigid, given once for all. For him, a thing either exists or it does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and be something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude each other. Cause and effect stand in rigid antithesis to each other. We can use a practical example here. A metaphysicist may study every neuron in the brain individually. He may study how long the axon is, how quickly electricity goes from one end to the other, how many dendrites it has, etc. But can you really understand a neuron without understanding every other neuron? Can you understand the function of a neuron without understanding that it is part of a brain? The metaphysical analysis precludes such investigation because everything must be analyzed individually. He goes on to write, in the metaphysical mode of thought, justifiable and necessary as it is in a number of domains whose extent varies according to the nature of the particular object in investigation, sooner or later reaches a limit, beyond which it becomes one-sided, restricted, abstract, lost in insoluble contradictions. It is the contemplation of individual things. It forgets the connection between them in the contemplation of their existence. It forgets the beginning and end of that existence in their repose. It forgets their motion. It cannot see the wood for the trees. Going back to the earlier example, of course, a metaphysical approach was necessary in the infancy of neuroscience. It was necessary to measure the length of the axon. It was necessary to identify how quickly electricity was conducted. But later, as the study of neuroscience progressed, a metaphysical approach was no longer in keeping. It was no longer capable of solving the more complex questions now that we had that metaphysical understanding. It was no longer capable of seeing the wood for the trees. In order to understand real change, in order to understand cause and effect and the relationship between all things, we need a dialectical approach. Engles writes, none of these processes and modes of thought enters into the framework of metaphysical reasoning. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their relationships, ideas, and essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. Such processes are those mentioned above, therefore, so many corroborations of its own method of perception. He goes on to say that nature is the proof of dialectics, and it must be said for modern science that it has furnished this proof with very rich materials increasing daily, and thus it has shown that, in the last resort, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring cycle, but goes through a real historical evolution. Engels writes that in discovering that nature is proof of dialectics, Darwin must be named before all others. Darwin dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants, animals, and man himself, are the products of the process of evolution going on millions of years. The metaphysical analysis that the only way something can change is quantitatively, that something can get bigger or smaller, but not fundamentally change, stands in the face of evolution. So if one believes in evolution, they must believe that nature is dialectical. He talked next about Hegel. Hegel was an idealist. To him, the thoughts within his brain were not the more or less abstract pictures of actual things and processes, but conversely, things in their evolution were only realized as pictures of the whole, quote, idea, existing somewhere from eternity before the world was. This way of thinking turned everything upside down and completely reversed the actual connection of things in the world. The Hegelian system itself was suffering, in fact, from an internal and incurable contradiction. Its essential proposition was that conception of human history is a process of evolution, which, by its very nature, cannot find its intellectual final form in the discovery of any so-called absolute truth, but on the other hand, it laid claim to being the very essence of this absolute truth. So, dialectically, if nature is always changing, then what we find to be the absolute truth would also be always changing. So the idealist notion that we can find this absolute truth, acknowledgement of this fundamental contradiction in Hegelian and German idealism, Engels wrote, led necessarily back to materialism. The new facts of the bourgeois revolution and continued development of capitalism. The new facts made imperative a new examination of all past history. When it was seen that all past history, with the exception of its primitive stages, was the history of class struggles, that these warring classes of society are always the products of the modes of production and exchange, in a word, of the economic conditions of their time, that the economic structure of society always furnishes the real basis starting from which we can alone work out the ultimate explanation of the whole superstructure of juridical and political institution, as well as that of the religious, philosophical, and other ideas of the given historical period. In this section, Engels explains how the base is changed by changing modes of production, and he also shows how the base can give rise to the superstructure, which is basically everything not directly related to those modes of production. He goes on to say, from that time forward, socialism was no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggle between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The task was no longer to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historico-economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. But the socialism of earlier days was as incompatible with this materialistic conception as the conception of nature and French of the French materialist was with the dialectics of modern natural science. The socialism of earlier days certainly criticized the existing capitalistic mode of production and its consequences, but it could not explain them, and therefore could not get mastery of them. It could only simply reject them as bad. The more strongly this earlier socialism denounced the exploitation of the working class, inevitable under capitalism, the less able it was to clearly show what this exploitation consisted of and how it arose. But for this it was necessary, 1. To present the capitalistic mode of production in its historical connection and its inevitableness during a particular historical period, and therefore also to present its inevitable downfall, and 2. To lay bare its essential character, which was still a secret. This was done by the discovery of surplus value. It was shown that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the basis of capitalist mode of production, and of the exploitation of the workers that occurs under it. That even if the capitalist buys the labor power of his laborer at the full value as a commodity on the market, he yet extracts more value from this than he paid for. And that in the ultimate analysis, this surplus value forms those sums of value from which he heaped up and are constantly increasing masses of capital in the hands of the possessing class. The genesis of capitalist production and the production of capital were both explained. Here he shows that by using a materialist and dialectical approach, only now are socialists able to fully explain capitalism, explain how capitalism developed out of feudalism, and show that as feudalism gave way for capitalism, so can capitalism give way to socialism. Engels writes in the very next paragraph, these two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalistic production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. The next thing was to work out all the details and relation. The materialist conception of history starts from the position that the production of the means to support human life and, next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure. That in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which the wealth is distributed and the society divided into classes and orders is dependent on what is produced, how it is produced, and how these products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social change and political revolutions are sought, not in men's brains, not in men's better insight into internal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. The growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust, that reason has become unreason and right wrong, is only proof that in the modes of production and exchange, changes have silently taken place, with which the social order, adapted to earlier economic conditions, is no longer in keeping. From this it follows that the means of getting rid of the incongruities that have been brought to light must also be present in a more or less developed condition within the changes of mode of production themselves. These means are not to be invented by deduction from fundamental principles, but they are to be discovered in the stubborn facts of the existing systems of production. Next, Engels begins to create a historical account of changes in the modes of production. In the medieval stage of evolution of the production of commodities, the question as to the owner of the product of labor could not arise. The individual producer, as a rule, had, from raw material belonging to himself, and generally his own handiwork, produced by his own tools, by the labor of his own hands or of the hands of his family, there was no need for him to appropriate the new product. It belonged wholly to him, as a matter of course. His property in the product was. Engels goes on to discuss ways where capitalism has proletarianized people. The number of these permanent wage workers was further enormously linked by breaking up of feudal system that occurred at the same time by the disbanding of the retainers of the feudal lords, the evictions of the peasants from their homesteads, etc. The separation was made complete between the means of production concentrated in the hands of capitalists on the one side and the producers possessing nothing but their labor power on the other. This contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In this section, Engels hints at the commons, which were a place during feudal times that was commonly owned by all of the peasants. One easy example is somebody could go to the commons, chop down a tree, and that would be their firewood. But when capitalism arose, they, as Engels said, evicted the peasants from their homesteads and made all of those commons private property. So no longer could you go to the common land and chop down a tree. Now you had to buy firewood. Because of this, peasants were forced to be proletarianized and to start doing wage labor, or else they would starve and freeze. Engels also discusses imperialism long before Lenin described it. By this, the old peaceful, stable condition of things was ended. Wherever this organization of production was introduced into a branch of industry, it brooked no other method of production by its side. The field of labor became a battleground. The great geographical discoveries and the colonization following upon them multiplied markets and quickened the transformation of handicraft into manufacture. The war did not simply break out between individual producers and particular localities. The war struggles begat in their turn national conflicts, the commercial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. He also describes unemployment and why an army of the unemployed is necessary at most times under capitalism. But the perfecting of machinery is making human labor superfluous. If the introduction and increase of machinery means the displacement of millions of manual by a few machine workers, improvement in the machinery means the displacement of more and more of the machine workers themselves. It means, in the last instance, the production of a number of available wage workers in excess of the average needs of capital. The formation of a complete industrial reserve army, as I called it in 1845, available at the times when industry is working at high pressure, to be cast out upon the street when the inevitable crash comes, a constant dead weight on the limbs of the working class in its struggle for existence with capital, a regulator for keeping the wages down to the low level that suits the interests of capital. In this, as early as 1845, Engels describes the cyclical nature of unemployment levels and how it is necessary for the capitalists to keep a large portion of the population unemployed so that they can be called to work during those boom cycles and cast off during the bust cycles. He then goes on to describe the boom and bust cycles, which we might know as bull markets, depressions, recessions, things like that. As a matter of fact, since 1825, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange among all civilized people and their more or less barbaric hangers-on are thrown out of joint about once every 10 years. Commerce is at a standstill. The markets are glutted. The products accumulate, the multitudinous as they are unsellable. Hard cash disappears. Credit vanishes. Factories are closed. The mass of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows upon bankruptcy, execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually become to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter. The canter in turn grows into a headlong gallop, of which a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after a breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis. And so, over and over again, we have now, since the year 1825, gone through this 5 times, and at the present moment, 1877, we are going through it for a 6th time. And the character of these crises is so clearly defined that Fourier hit them all off when he first described it as a crisis from plethora. So in this, Engels describes historically that recessions and depressions are an inherent feature of capitalism, and try as they might, bourgeois economists cannot prevent them from happening. Finally, Engels discusses the process of proletarian revolution. But when once their nature is understood, they can, in the hands of the producers working together, be transformed from master demons into willing servants. With this recognition, at last, the real nature of the productive forces of today, the social anarchy of production, gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definitive plan, according to the needs of the community and the needs of the individual. Then the capitalist mode of appropriation, which in the present enslaves first the producer and then the appropriator, is replaced by the mode of appropriation of the products that is based upon the nature of modern means of production, upon, in one hand, direct social appropriation as means to the maintenance and extension of the production, on the other, direct individual appropriation as means of subsistence and enjoyment. So in this, he describes very clearly that the anarchy of production must give way to organized production, first to improve the forces of production and perfect them, and second, for individual appropriation to help sustain them. So currently, the United States has an anarchy of production, which is, quote, the free market. This free market will be replaced with a planned economy, which first seeks to perfect the measures and ways of production in our situation to make them greener, to make them less disastrous to the environment, and second, to direct individual appropriation as means of subsistence and enjoyment, to fix water pipes, to end hunger, to end illiteracy. Next, he writes, while the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms a great majority of the population into proletarians, it creates the power which, under penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution. Whilst it forces more and more of the transformation of the vast means of production already socialized into state property, it shows itself the way of accomplishing this revolution. The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. Here in Engels, you can see the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. So the dictatorship of the proletariat turns the means of production into state property. This is something lost from our utopian comrades who believe that we can immediately transition from capitalism to communism without a period of what they may call state capitalism. But in doing this, Engels writes, it abolishes itself as the proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, abolishes also the state as a state. Society thus far, based on class antagonisms, has needed the state, that is, of an organization of the particular class, which was pro tempore the exploiting class, an organization for the purpose of preventing any interference from without with the existing conditions of production, and therefore especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the condition of oppression, corresponding with the given mode of production, parentheses, slavery, serfdom, wage labor. The state was the official representative of a society as a whole, the gathering of it, viz. Together. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, the gathering of it together into visible embodiment. But this was only so far as it was the state of the class for which it represented. For the time being, society as a whole in ancient times, the state of the slave-owning citizens, in the Middle Ages, the state of the feudal lords, and in our time, the state of the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes a real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based on our present anarchy of production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be requested as a special repressive force from the state, which is no longer necessary. The first act by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole of society, the taking of possession of the means of production in the name of society, this is at the same time its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and it dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives measure to the value of the phrase a free state, both as to its justifiable use at times by agitators and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the demands of the so-called anarchists for the abolition of the state out of hand. These points are later clarified by Lenin. So first, we should note that Engels writes, the state is not abolished, it dies out over time. This is in contrast to the anarchists' goal of abolition of the state immediately. He writes that the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. But in doing this, it abolishes itself as the proletariat and abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms. So the abolishment of class distinctions and class antagonisms abolishes the need for the state. But Engels may not have put this as clearly as possible, but it was later clarified by Lenin and others, that this abolition of all class distinctions and class antagonisms does not happen immediately. Simply seizing political power does not abolish the bourgeoisie. Simply taking away all of their money and all of their private property does not abolish the bourgeoisie. This is something that Engels may not have been able to foresee because he did not live in the time of proletarian revolution. But we can see experimentally and historically that in the USSR, in China, in every socialist experiment, seizing political power by the proletarian class did not instantly abolish the bourgeoisie, did not instantly abolish class antagonisms, and therefore it is impossible to instantly abolish the state. Engels goes on to write, with the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously, the mastery of production over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced by systematic, definite organization. The struggle for individual existence disappears. Then, for the first time, man, in a certain sense, is finally marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom, and emerges from mere animal conditions of existence into really human ones. Engels goes on to describe the proletarian revolution as the fourth stage in historical evolution. The proletarian revolution, solution of the contradictions. The proletariat seizes public power, and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have borne thus far, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society thenceforth unnecessary. In proportion as anarchy of social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. Man, at last master of his own form of social organization, becomes at the same time lord over nature, his own master, free. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions, and thus the very nature of this act, to impart now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and the meaning of the monumentous act is called upon to accomplish. This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism.